Suzanne?
Yeah.
Are you?
Okay, so I'm the daughter's boyfriend,
Okay.
and I'm here
Is
to...
this your truck?
That's my truck.
Somebody should be driving. Never mind, I got something here.
Where is it? Where's the bike?
Oh, it's right there.
Where was it?
It was like just right down here in this little embankment right here. So, sorry, GPS dude. We got the husband on scene here with me. I know this is a weird question, but do Barry and Suzanne get along pretty well?
The date was May the 10th, 2020, Mother's Day, and on this day, beloved mother and wife Suzanne Morphew had vanished from her home in Colorado. What officers found were the hallmark signs of a terrible crime. To begin with, her bike had been discovered not far from the family home, lying awkwardly at the base of a steep drop. However, not only was there no damage to the frame and no skid marks, but her helmet, which was found more than a mile away, made no geographical sense either, and when they got round to checking the family home, well, that would lead to only more concern and confusion. However, one thing was for certain, that Suzanne was now all of a sudden gone. And by the way, there was no evidence to suggest that she ever intended to leave. No goodbyes, no text messages, and no further online activity. In fact, there are a lot of no's in this story, as you are just about to find out. In a town surrounded by wilderness, it was almost as if Suzanne had been swallowed by the forest, leaving behind nothing but silence and 1,000 unanswered questions. However, piece by piece, detectives would build an incredibly solid case that would essentially solve this mystery. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're diving into a story filled with lies, sneaking around, and a whole lot of evidence. We're diving straight into this one, folks, so please grab yourself a coffee, subscribe for more stories like this every week, and let's brew up an investigation. This is the case of Suzanne Morphew. It's hard to believe that such a story could ever happen in a town like Salida, Colorado, where the forests stretch endlessly beneath crisp mountain air, and the Arkansas River carves through the town that seems to be frozen in time. It is the kind of place where life does seem to move a little bit slower. In Salida, porch lights flicker on at dusk, and the loudest sound at night is the wind through the pines. People here don't seem to lock their doors out of habit, but merely out of routine, because crime, well, that tends to happen somewhere else. But saying that, something about Salida made it the perfectly ominous place for a mystery like this. Because behind those postcard-perfect views and sun-dappled trails, the isolation here seems to cut both ways. And when the forest swallows a secret hole, it rarely gives it back. It was at 5:46 p.m. on May the 10th, 2020, which just so happened to be Mother's Day, that concerned neighbors called the police to report Suzanne Morphew as missing. Her children had got in touch with them to voice their concerns, because Suzanne hadn't been responding to any of their messages or phone calls. Her daughters were away from the property at the time, as was her husband, Barry. So, the plan was for officers to meet the neighbor, Martin, who confirmed that he had knocked on the property's front door but received no response. Suzanne was known to ride her bike in the area, as biking was one of her favorite hobbies, and it was also noted by the neighbors that her bike did seem to be missing from the property at this time. By 7:30 that evening, her disappearance had begun to grow more urgently, and so officers made their way along County Road 225, which is a narrow winding road branching off from Highway 50 and not far from the Morphew residence. By the way, this is a note to say that we'll be looking at body cam footage for a few minutes for valuable context. I have tried to condense this down to the bare minimum, and then we'll go back to the usual format after. Officers crept along the path slowly, scanning the steep incline that bordered the road and hoping to spot any trace of Suzanne or her bicycle. And then, just as they turned a bend near the base of its hill, that is when they saw it. A blue Santa Cruz mountain bike, which was lying awkwardly near the edge of a ravine, with its front tire pointed sharply downward and toward the creek below. Now, at first glance, it did look like the kind of spot where a serious crash might have happened. But as they approached the area, something did seem to feel off. There was no blood and no sign of impact. In fact, the whole surrounding vegetation was completely undisturbed. Not bent, not trampled, and not flattened in any way. In other words, if someone really had fallen here, then they didn't land the way that you'd expect. And despite the steep rocky drop, the bike itself was not damaged whatsoever. There was no bent frame, no broken gears, and no scuffs along the handlebars. In fact, it didn't look like it had been ridden down the hill at all. More like it had been placed there. When Deputy Brown picked up the bike and then returned it to the path, he noticed something else. The front brake pad was seized, and the handlebars had been twisted completely to the left, therefore causing the brake cables to wrap tightly around the frame, and therefore making the bike kind of difficult or even impossible to ride. They also examined the dirt shoulder, which was just above where the bike had been found. They noted that if Suzanne had in fact lost control coming down that hill, then there should be signs like tire tracks, skid marks, and disturbed soil. But lo and behold, there was nothing. That is when they decided to head to the property and meet with Suzanne's daughter's boyfriend. And what he had to share with the officers was very interesting.
Are you?
Okay, so I'm the daughter's boyfriend,
Okay.
and I'm here
Is
to...
this your truck?
That's my truck.
Somebody should be having, never mind, I got something here. So you haven't seen the mom at all, have you?
Yep, so the two daughters are gone right now at the moment. The dad is in Denver for a job, and they text her because of Mother's Day, and they haven't heard. The text never went through, like it never delivered since this morning. And she's a big mountain biker. She normally takes her car, and her bike's normally in the back of that. It's gone.
Was this open when you came here?
The neighbor was here that opened it, and then she shut it, and she went back to her house. Her house is right over there.
What kind of jackets does she wear?
I mean, a windbreaker.
A windbreaker?
I don't know what color.
I saw her.
I mean, we don't even know what time she left today. Yeah.
But they have cameras.
They have cameras, but they've been out of commission for a while.
Hey, 11, can you get a list of stuff that
So her bike was close to the road?
Yeah, I'm working on that right now.
That's good.
I know this is a weird question, but do Barry and Suzanne get along pretty well?
You can answer honestly.
You know, I think they've had some problems.
Okay.
Yeah, in the past.
Like, just normal...
Normal husband and wife type deal.
Oh, they, like, talk about separating or anything
they
like
have,
that?
yeah.
Okay.
I would, yeah.
And just like that, officers now had their first whiff of a potential motive. Of course, should Suzanne's disappearance be more than a temporary thing? And then, finally, not even half an hour later, her husband Barry arrived at the scene.
Where is it? Where's the bike?
Oh, it's right there.
Where was it?
It was like just right down here in this little embankment right here. So, sorry, GPS dude. We got the husband on scene here with me.
I'm here with my daughter. She's at Barry's
Oh,
house.
okay. All right, yeah, you can go down
Was it
there.
a crash?
I mean, the bike looked, the way it was laid, it kind of looked like it, but there's not really that much damage to the bike. That's the thing.
Lion?
Yeah, it was just like
Was
lying.
it no a lion? Mountain lion?
As you can see, Barry seemed to be genuinely shocked and distraught that his wife was now all of a sudden missing. However, let's just say that there was a lot that officers didn't know, and a lot more that he didn't either. Because, as it turns out, detectives had already swept the property, and what they found were a few interesting clues left behind. But before we get to that, let's first talk about Barry and Suzanne and what their relationship was really like, because, as you know, several people around them already knew that things were shaky, to say the least. Growing up in the same town, the two met as teenagers in the late 1980s, and with them meeting so long ago, there is a lot of history between the two. Beginning with Suzanne, she was born on April 30th, 1971, and grew up in the same small town of Alexandria, Indiana. As the youngest of 4 children, she was known as a friendly and popular girl in her community, and graduated Alexandria Monroe High School in 1989. She then went on to Purdue University, where she earned a degree in elementary education, and after college, she returned to her hometown and became an elementary teacher who was beloved by her students and colleagues colleagues alike. She was known for her kindness and her patience, and those who knew Suzanne well described her as warm, compassionate, and devoted to her family. 4 years older than Suzanne, Barry Morphew was born on October the 17th, 1967, and, of course, also grew up in Alexandria. Within this tight community, the Morphew name was actually well known. Barry was a star athlete in high school and a talented baseball player who was even drafted by the Toronto Blue Jays. He was outgoing, athletic, and loved the outdoors. And after his brief brush with a potential baseball career, he decided to settle into life in Indiana. He became an avid hunter and eventually a deer farmer, raising trophy deer on a farm property, before then going on to build a successful landscaping business from the ground up, earning a reputation for being a provider for his family and a man proud of his work ethic. But the story between Barry and Suzanne actually started a few years prior, and the two began dating when she was still in high school and after Barry had graduated. They say that the young couple were absolutely smitten, and they gladly shared the same Midwestern roots and Christian values. The pair married on August the 5th, 1994, when Suzanne was 23 and Barry 27. It was a picture-perfect summer wedding, and the couple seemed destined for a happy life together, and they would have that too for quite a long while. In the early years of marriage, they remained near their families. Suzanne became a school teacher, and Barry a landscaping business owner, and with both of their careers thriving, it allowed them to provide a comfortable life for their future family. After 6 years of marriage, Barry and Suzanne finally welcomed their first daughter, Mallory, and 4 years later, in 2003, their second daughter, Macy. It is safe to say that these two girls became their everything, and on the sidelines, the Morphews were active in their church and their community, and by all appearances, they had a strong, family-oriented, and faith-centered marriage. But sadly, they faced adversity together too, when, in her 20s, Suzanne was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and although she would eventually beat it, she had to face a second round only a few years later. But thankfully, all this did was make the family's bond stronger, and Barry stood by Suzanne throughout the entirety of her chemotherapy, and when she finally went into remission in 2018, it felt like there was a whole new lease of life for the family. It was around this time that the Morphew family decided for a big change, and they moved to Colorado in 2018 when they purchased a $1.5 million home on a 7-acre plot of land. I mean, all of this made sense, because by now, their oldest daughter Mallory had started attending college in Colorado, and with all of the stress of Suzanne's health, they decided to have a fresh start somewhere new. However, unofficially, friends began to whisper that their marriage had unfortunately become under strain, and this relocation was an attempt to rekindle their relationship in a new environment. The initial years in Colorado seemed good for the family. Suzanne adored the mountains, and Barry was still able to continue his landscaping business, and together they spent a lot of good time in the great outdoors. There are many photos to show the couple on hikes and at their daughter's school events. However, behind closed doors, trouble was unfortunately brewing. Over time, Suzanne's close friends began to hear troubling things about their marriage, and according to her siblings, she confided that Barry not only had a temper, but was controlling too. Apparently, he would obsessively monitor her whereabouts and was even possessive. In fact, Suzanne even made implications that she was concerned about her own safety around Barry, and that perhaps the marriage had started to deteriorate quite significantly. And here comes the sticky part. But by 2018, and unknown to Barry, Suzanne had actually reconnected with an old friend named Jeff from high school, and what began as a casual check-in soon blossomed into an intense emotional affair, and only 1 year later, a physical one. While Barry was busy with his work, Suzanne and Jeff would secretly speak to each other through burner phones. They would even secretly meet in person during Suzanne's trips out of town, beginning in 2019 and continuing right the way through to a secret holiday in Florida in early 2020. It is no surprise that, by now, Suzanne's text messages to friends had become rather harsh towards her husband. She described Barry's mood swings and his controlling behavior in greater detail, claiming that not only did she want peace, but also hoping that Barry would merely get fed up and leave. I mean, she even kept a private list on her phone which was titled 50 Reasons Why I Want Barry to Leave. When your breakup has its own spreadsheet, you know it's serious. I'm just surprised that she capped it at 50. By the year 2020, Suzanne had finally made her mind up and was going to leave Barry and officially end the marriage. In fact, on May the 6th of that same year, she would even explicitly tell him that she was done. Of course, she disappeared only a few days later. And no surprise, but when officers learned of that detail, they became very suspicious. I mean, they already knew that the two were having issues, but that moment, that would have been extremely emotional for Barry. In fact, as you can see here, in a text message, Suzanne wrote, "I'm done. I could care less what you're up to and have been for years. We just need to figure this out civilly." And so, after 26 years of marriage, the life that Barry knew, including his family, his pride as a provider, and his very identity, wasn't only threatened, but essentially obliterated overnight. And soon enough, the world would learn that there were darker currents beneath his wholesome persona. But were they really dangerous enough to insinuate murder? Well, as we know, only a few days after Suzanne told Barry that she was done, she suddenly disappeared. It was Mother's Day, and by mid-morning, both of their daughters had texted her, but unfortunately, to their surprise, got no reply. Suzanne, who was always ever attentive, wasn't responding to any of her calls or messages. And as the hours passed with silence, her girls grew worried and then contacted their father. But Barry was not near the property either. Apparently, he was in Broomfield, Colorado for a pre-scheduled landscaping job. In fact, surveillance cameras would even record him at that hotel at 11:38 that morning. So, he couldn't have possibly been home when she had vanished. Right? Barry tried to call Suzanne, but of course was also met with silence, and by the afternoon had asked a neighbor to check on her. He also specifically asked the neighbor to see if Suzanne's mountain bike was in the garage, which, okay, was a little bit of an odd request, but maybe it was just a hunch. By late afternoon, deputies arrived, which, of course, would then lead us to that body cam footage in question. Now, when informed about the bike, you might have expected that Barry would then race home in a panic, but instead, he remained on the job for several more hours. Phone records show that after getting the phone call, he then travelled past his hotel in Broomfield, where he then dropped off some tools and a shovel, and only left after 6 p.m. By the time he got home, it was nearly 9 p.m, where, of course, in body cam footage, he then looked frazzled and worried. Whatever the case, by sundown, the search for Suzanne was in full swing. Teams of police officers, volunteers, neighbours, and even the FBI combed the area, which included the use of ATVs, boats, and even helicopters. In the days immediately following her disappearance, both Barry and their daughters would put on a show of desperate hope. In fact, he would even go live on television to release this emotional video.
Oh, Suzanne, if anyone is out there that can hear this, that has you, please, we'll do whatever it takes to bring you back. We love you, we miss you, your girls need you. No questions asked. However much they want, I will do whatever it takes to get you back. Honey, I love you. I want you back so bad.
But as investigators dug deeper into Suzanne's case, bizarre clues slowly began to emerge, and those clues shifted their focus. Inside of Suzanne's SUV, deputies found her sunglasses and a hydration backpack, items which she was known to always take on her rides. It now began to look like she never went on a bike ride at all that day, and investigators quietly began to suspect the scene was staged to mislead them. Meanwhile, inside the home, they noticed what could be minor signs of a struggle. For instance, a doorframe to the master bedroom was cracked, a dark vertical split in the wood that was not there when the house was sold to them. Meanwhile, in the laundry room, another hint of foul play turned up. While collecting evidence, police officers found a plastic cap for a syringe inside of the dryer. They noted that the cap is the type typically used on a tranquilizer dart, and her husband did own a tranquilizer gun that was used for animals. In fact, Barry was even known to keep tranquilizer darts and a dart gun as part of his deer farming and hunting hobby. But why would a cap from a tranquilizer syringe be found in the dryer with bedding? Speaking of bedding, an unspent bullet casing was found next to the couple's bed. And on that note, why had all of the linen been cast to the side in their daughter's bedroom too? All of this was just a little bit odd. Another dramatic discovery came 10 days after Suzanne vanished, because tucked away in the back of her closet was what looked like an ordinary pen. However, in reality, it was actually a spy pen, that being a recorder that was disguised as one. As it turns out, Suzanne believed that Barry was actually the one having an affair, and she wanted to catch him out on it. But ironically, the only thing the device would record was many phone calls of her own affair instead. Now, believe it or not, but it would actually take the investigators 6 months to identify this mystery man on the recordings. Because this guy Jeff, who lived in Michigan with his own wife and children, would not actually come forward after her disappearance. In fact, he'd even taken multiple steps to delete all of their messages out of fear. But once he was finally tracked by the officers, he fully cooperated. And not only did he have a lot of information to share with them, but he was also cleared of any suspicion. That is with the police at least, but I'm sure that his actual wife found him to be entirely culpable. Now, there is actually a lot more to this affair. It turns out that Jeff and Suzanne actually first hooked up at a house party in college decades prior. And with her and Barry already a couple back then, even that encounter was unfaithful. Only a couple of days later, Barry found Jeff on the golf course where he was moments away from, quote, beating him down. He only stopped after Jeff convinced him that it simply wasn't worth it, and he promised to leave his girlfriend alone. After that encounter, Jeff and Suzanne didn't message each other again until the year 2018. It was Suzanne who broke the ice by messaging him on LinkedIn saying, "Howdy stranger." From that point onwards, they began to talk on the phone platonically, before eventually starting an affair. All while Suzanne gave him numerous reasons why she wanted to leave Barry. It is worth noting here that, by now, Jeff was already married to another woman and had several kids. As the affair amped up, so did the tension between Suzanne and Barry. Barry grew paranoid and was quite suspicious of his wife, and Suzanne, well, she certainly did not help that situation. However, Barry responded in concerning ways too. He often asked to see her phone, and would even stalk her while she was with friends. I mean, it turns out that he did actually have a reason to be suspicious, because between October of 2018 and December of 2019, Jeff and Suzanne called each other a staggering total of 738 times. Now, although she believed that Barry was also having an affair, there is actually no concrete evidence to suggest this. He even sent her a message several days before she disappeared to say, "I promise you were wrong about all the crazy thoughts about me. I have always been faithful. Only a fool would stray from an angel like you." But the deeper that investigators looked, the worse it became. In an interview with officers, one of the daughters confirmed that their marriage was not doing well, that they had also discussed divorce in the past, and that a separation was probably for the best. However, the other daughter denied knowing about any marital issues, and would even go on to describe their marriage as very loving. But apparently, Barry's interview with officers was rife with suspicion, and throughout this interview, detectives would notice several glaring inconsistencies. To begin with, he explained that he left the property at 5 AM that morning, and that he left his wife sound asleep in bed. Later on in the day, he then texted her Happy Mother's Day, but never received a response. However, not only had his story changed of when he last saw Suzanne, but both phone and vehicle data would later confirm that his entire account of where he was that morning was incorrect. Both the drive to the hotel and the times he was there were inconsistent. He would also consistently flop between describing their marriage and their final night together as perfect, to then going on to admitting that they did in fact have quite the horrible argument. And remember his drive to Broomfield on the morning she disappeared? Well, it turns out that he was actually supposed to drive there with a colleague the following day. But instead, he left the home alone at 5 AM that Sunday morning. Safe to say that detectives were now very suspicious of Barry, as were many other members of the public too. And as the days turned into weeks, there was still no sign of his wife whatsoever. It was kind of like she had just disappeared that morning, never to be seen again. Almost an entire month went by, and search parties were still out there every day looking for her. Barry stuck to his story, suggesting that maybe his wife had been abducted, murdered by friends, or even taken hostage by a mountain lion. In fact, that did seem to be his leading theory, while also blaming detectives, as seen in this video here.
What seems to have happened from the investigators, and they don't give much, and I've got private people working for me, is maybe she was abducted right here. And they found an article going west of hers. They won't tell us what it is. So they sent another team after they found the article that covered this hillside all the way down to the river pretty good. My concerns were this way and that way if it was the cat, because the cats, they drag their prey up the mountain and out of people's. We can't find sign for the cat, but we got rain like right away.
Yeah.
Could have washed away sign.
So they found her bike just right against that tree down there?
Well, no, it was on the ground. It was, the wheel was facing, and the sheriff department, they screwed everything up. They shouldn't have touched it.
Oh,
So
really?
they left it. It's evidence. They pulled it up, and then the sheriff we had cars over here. Well, the sheriff let everybody drive through here, covering all, or messing up all the evidence. They were walking all over this area, which if somebody abducted her, they would have had foot tracks. They would have fingerprints on the bike.
And that would have all been
let
gone.
10 other people touch the bike.
Oh man.
I mean, we was really upset that first night. But I was in Denver, so
Oh, you were?
I didn't get here until 9 o'clock that night.
Yeah.
And my friend's an Army Ranger, and he knows this stuff better than anybody.
Despite everything they had against him, detectives decided to hold off for a while, because without a body, well, building a solid case against Barry would be next to near impossible. In the months that followed, Barry began to liquidate all of the family's assets. This included selling their first home in Indiana, and only 2 months after Suzanne disappeared, even selling her Range Rover. Which is kind of strange, right? Because surely if your wife just suddenly vanished without a trace, then you'd want to hold on to her car just in case she came back. And if that wasn't enough already, then only a few months later, he would go on to sell their very own home on Puma Path. And not for pocket change either, because that would sell for a cool $1.6 million. Whatever happened to Suzanne, and whether he had anything to do with it or not, it looked like Barry was ready to close this chapter of his life, cash in, and then move on. And he did so with the full support of his daughters. However, that would not last very long, because as the 1-year mark approached, detectives came knocking at his front door. And what they had in their hand was an arrest warrant. On the morning of May the 5th, 2021, Barry was finally arrested near his home in Poncha Springs. He was then arrested and charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder, tampering with physical evidence, and attempting to influence a public servant, with that last charge related to false statements that he gave to investigators. The news of Barry's arrest shocked some, but validated others. And to those who had followed the case closely, it actually felt inevitable. As the case moved towards its preliminary hearing, parts of the evidence became public, and the released affidavits painted a very dark picture. Investigators testified about the tranquilizer dart cap found in the dryer, the discovery of Barry's tranquilizer gun and darts in the garage, and a damning timeline pieced together from his cell phone and truck data, which, they argued, tracked his suspicious movements on the day of the crime. And surprisingly, that is not even counting what we've already discussed, because trust me, there was a lot more. For example, Barry's GPS data from the day that Suzanne vanished showed some seriously strange behavior. At precisely 2:47 p.m, his phone was switched into airplane mode, cutting it off from the network. And over the next hour or so, the GPS picked up frantic movement. It showed that his phone was darting all over the property, bouncing from point to point. Now, apparently, Barry would later claim that he was outside shooting chipmunks with a rifle, which is a bizarre explanation at the best of times, and the investigators were not buying it either. They believed that Barry had actually tranquilized Suzanne and was then chasing her around the house as the drug slowly took effect, which is a terrifying thing to think about, as this means that Suzanne would have been slipping into unconsciousness as she tried to run away. And then were the photos. Images taken of Barry the next day show scratches and abrasions all across his hands and arms. Now, Barry claims that they were actually from work, but in my mind, these marks look far more like defensive wounds, kind of like someone had clawed at him with their fingernails as they fought back. And as for Barry's time in Broomfield, well, that didn't exactly help his case either. Investigators believe that he staged Suzanne's bike down a hill to make it look like an accident or possibly an abduction, and along the highway on his way out of town, they suspect that he then tossed her helmet out of his truck window. By that point, Suzanne was likely unconscious or maybe even perhaps dead. It is theorized that Barry then secured her body, probably hidden at another location, and then planned to deal with it once he had more time. Between 3:25 and 3:48 that morning, the doors to his Ford F-350 were opened and then closed multiple times. At 3:56, his phone was unlocked, and then, at 4:23, Suzanne's phone registered with a local cell tower for the very last time. At around 5 a.m., and confirmed by his own reports, and as the sun was just beginning to rise, Barry then hit the road toward Broomfield for what he claimed was a work trip. However, he was not only carrying tools, because as it turns out, he was also carrying incriminating evidence. By 8 a.m., he checked into his Broomfield hotel, but strangely didn't do much work on the job. Co-workers say that he seemed agitated, and one would even say that they saw him carrying large trash bags to the dumpsters. And that is true, because over the next few hours, he made 5 separate stops at dumpsters all across the town. Surveillance footage later captured him dumping trash at random spots, including behind a gas station, into a McDonald's bin, and even at a dumpster near his hotel. He would even claim that he traveled to McDonald's to buy a Big Mac, but then changed his mind and ate a granola bar instead. I guess it turns out that he was on a diet of lies and deceit. Investigators believe that all of these were strategic trash runs, where he then discarded bloody rags, packaging for the tranquilizer darts, and anything else that might connect him to the crime. In one of those dumpsters, police would later find an empty tranquilizer dart case, matching the exact kind that Barry had. And here is the real kicker, but all of these trash runs happened before anyone knew that Suzanne was missing. So, if Barry really were innocent, then he spent all of Mother's Day frantically dumping trash and bleaching his hotel room without once trying to call or wish his wife a happy Mother's Day. He then travelled back to his hotel, and between 12:42 and 6:03 p.m. he didn't leave. When he did finally check out, a cleaner claimed that apparently the room reeked of bleach. Wet towels were scattered all over the place. Now, Barry claims that he was just merely washing off dust, but the smell, well, that told a different story. It kind of smelled like someone had been scrubbing something away. And to investigators, this wasn't merely odd, it was damning. However, this case was still far from over, because despite all of this evidence being available, they still didn't have one crucial thing. And of course, that was a body. As a result, he pleaded not guilty to all counts, and with no body and, well, largely circumstantial evidence, the prosecution faced an uphill battle. Even still, they remained confident. In the meantime, Barry's defense team highlighted that there was no proof that he actually harmed Suzanne, including no eyewitnesses or a confession. And the case was almost derailed entirely when the prosecution failed to meet multiple deadlines for submitting evidence. And that's because the prosecution was still desperately searching for her body. And then, believe it or not, but facing the possibility of going to trial without one, the DA then made the dramatic call to dismiss all charges against Barry. Which means, just like that, he was effectively a free man and legally an innocent one. And only days later, he walked out of the Fremont County Courthouse with a broad smile and both daughters.
Barry, how does it feel? Barry Morphew was flanked by his family. His mother and sister were there, but closest to his side were his 2 daughters. While Barry is smiling, you can see his youngest daughter is beaming. The family ended up driving around the backside of the jail shortly after, where they continued to finalize details of his bond. While they offered no comment, the entire time you can see Morphew and his daughters appear to be elated. His daughters have been by his side since his arrest about 4.5 months ago.
As you can see, his daughters continued to stand firmly by his side, visibly overjoyed that their father was now finally free. As for Barry, he kept a relatively low profile after that. He and his daughters moved out of Salida, reportedly settling in another part of Colorado for a while, before then eventually moving on to Arizona. Soon enough, Barry then decided to push back against the authorities. He filed notices of intent to sue those he believed had wronged him, and in May of 2023, he and his legal team filed a $15 million lawsuit against prosecutors and all the investigators involved in his case, citing the year that he had lost to false accusations and the deep toll that it took on him and his family. One strange thing to mention here is that during this time, Barry found himself convicted of voter fraud after voting in the US election under Suzanne's name. When the FBI later asked why he did it, Barry shrugged and said that he just wanted Trump to win and figured she was going to vote for him anyway. Now, Barry claimed that he didn't actually realize this was illegal, even if it was for your wife. But he did ultimately plead guilty to forgery, and although he received no jail time, to many it actually said a lot. It showed that he was willing to bend the rules and even lie to get what he wanted. And it really does seem like he was becoming a little bit too arrogant here, because, unknown to him at the time, the police were onto something. On September the 22nd, 2023, Suzanne was finally found, deep in the rugged wilderness of Saguache County, Colorado, and about 45 miles south of their home. An investigation team conducting an unrelated search stumbled upon a shallow grave. Inside, they discovered skeletal remains and shreds of clothing, and within days, dental records confirmed that it unfortunately was Suzanne. The location was remote. It was a dry, high-desert clearing near the tiny town of Moffat, far from any main road or highway. But several details were both alarming and incredibly revealing here. For one, many of Suzanne's bones were significantly bleached, indicating that they had been on the surface and exposed to the sun for quite some time. Secondly, several parts of her skeleton seemed to be missing, including bones from her feet, and her shoes were also not present. Investigators would also find fragments of her bike clothing, and also a single unfired bullet near the grave. Given that her remains were both scattered and sun-bleached, anthropologists believe that Suzanne's body had likely decomposed at a different location before then being moved on to this site at a later date. In other words, she was murdered and then left somewhere, and then moved many months later. The implication here was chilling. Perhaps spooked by the ongoing searches or upcoming trial, had someone secretly transported her bones to a more distant hiding spot. Now, there is no public information onto when the remains were placed here. However, it is a question that will likely be answered in a trial yet to come.
Tonight, we're learning more about the discovery of the remains of Suzanne Morphew, the Salida mom who went missing on Mother's Day of 2020. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation announced it had discovered her remains near the town of Moffat.
That's about 2 hours southwest of Colorado Springs and not far from Sand Dunes National Park in Saguache County. KRDO News Channel 13's Annabelle Childers is live in Moffat at the area. Locals believe that discovery happened. Annabelle?
We are right off Highway 17 in Moffat, surrounded by bits and pieces of caution tape, and you can see 2 pieces right there tied to these plants. Now, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation will not confirm that this is exactly where Suzanne Morphew's remains were found, but several locals, including the Moffat fire chief, believe it is because they say they saw investigators here for multiple days over the weekend.
As you can imagine, this moment was bittersweet for her family. On one hand, it removed any hope that Suzanne was still alive, but on the other, it meant that they could finally lay her to rest. But perhaps even more importantly, it would also offer fresh evidence, because when this autopsy was publicly released in April of 2024, not only would it confirm that she was murdered, but also provide some brand new and shocking clues. Toxicology tests found traces of BAM in her system, which stands for these 3 things. But more specifically, BAM can only be found in wildlife tranquilizers. Which does ring a bell, doesn't it? And if that wasn't enough already, well, detectives had long known that Barry was actually the only person in the entire state of Colorado to be licensed and purchase it recently. And so, with that in mind, an arrest warrant was made for Barry once again. On June the 21st, 2025, Barry was once again arrested in Arizona. He didn't resist either. In fact, he reportedly told the officers that he had long suspected this day might come. Within days, he was extradited back to Colorado. And this time, he is definitely going to trial. The federal, state, and local authorities all made it very clear that this indictment was based on new facts and evidence that hadn't been available back in 2021. And sure enough, the new details focus heavily on the BAM tranquilizer, particularly Barry's exclusive access to it. Records show that Barry obtained multiple prescriptions for BAM while he was still living in Indiana. Not only that, but he was using it on deer as recently as April of 2020. That being being only 1 month before Suzanne was murdered. Turns out that between 2017 and 2020, not one single zoo, vet, or wildlife official in the entire region reported any use or purchase of BAM except Barry. So, if traces of BAM were found in Suzanne, well, there's really only one likely source. Despite this, Barry's daughters, who are both now in their 20s, still remain by his side. They continue to believe that their father is being unfairly persecuted. Looks like love is blind, especially when it's your own family. As of the time this video is being posted, Barry is once again awaiting trial. He has already made his first court appearance, and the judge has set his bond at a steep $3 million in cash only. Prosecutors believe that they now have the upper hand, and with Suzanne's body and the chemical evidence at their disposal, yes, absolutely, their case is now stronger than ever. But the chances are that Barry will not go down without a fight, and so I'm sure that his legal team are preparing for war. So, that is basically where we're at for now, and although Barry hasn't yet stood trial, I do think it's kind of obvious which way this will go. I did also want to cover this case while I could because, honestly, I do see this becoming the next Chris Watts story. And by the way, it is no surprise to learn that Barry's lawsuit against law enforcement has basically all but fallen apart. I don't think he'll be worrying about that much longer. Over the 5 years since that fateful Mother's Day, this story has taken some dizzying turns, basically cycling through theories, arrests, setbacks, and now finally a trial. And while the outcome feels all but inevitable, it is clear that this story is not yet over. It is a tragic one, no doubt, and Suzanne, she definitely did not deserve to die. But that is not to say that she handled everything perfectly either. From having a long-running affair to planting secret recording devices in her own home, it is clear that there were multiple layers of dysfunction here. But then again, if this really was an abusive relationship, then simply walking away is, well, never as simple as it seems. In hindsight, this marriage should have definitely ended multiple years prior, and in those hundreds of messages between the two, Barry came across as both self-loathing and explosively reactive. So, that is basically where we're at for now, and I'm sure that once this case actually wraps up and the dust settles, I will probably revisit it again. But for now, that is all I have on this one, folks. And by the way, thank you so much for making it this far and watching until the end. I really do appreciate you. As always, I'll see you again the same time next week, but in the meantime, make sure to look after each other and of course, stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.